All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Realignment has been the most popular topic around college football for at least the past 15 years. And like I've said before, and I'm going to say it again, my friends, don't expect it to die down anytime soon, as schools are always going to be chasing more football money from the bigger conferences. Now, I have talked about this topic for quite some time, and I've said college football, plain and simply, needs revenue sharing. It's one of those, where I think revenue sharing would really help college football just like it does in the pro ranks. And I'm not talking about, the big boys, inviting, little sisters of the poor to come play them in a homecoming game. I'm talking about, the bigger conferences that are generating, more money, TV wise to help out the other power conferences. But you know what? Easier said than done because that simply ain't going to happen. But when it's all said and done, what if, and I'm just speaking hypothetically because what I'm about to say clearly has no shape as far as like what's going to happen and what has happened and what is going to continue to happen on the college football landscape as far as teams jumping conferences, this, that, and the third. But what if we went back to college football conferences that focus on regions as well as rivalries? Now, I put together some conferences here, and some of them may not have an even number of schools. That's fine because basically we have seen uh the conferences all basically like doing away with the divisional format it's all about getting your top two teams to the conference championship game, and then from there, of course, trying to get to the college football playoff. And of course it's going to expand next year anyway. But it's one of those, even with that, I still think that it changes things up and like makes it more of a balanced playing surface, if you will. I would propose 9 game conference schedules all across the board for every conference, which is something that everybody doesn't do. And then, of course, one non-conference game against at least one of the other power conferences. And honestly, in my opinion, it could work. So I'm going to start off with the SEC. The SEC currently has 14 schools, and they're going to 16 next year when Oklahoma and Texas join. But right here, I've got a 13 team SEC. So no Texas A&M, no Missouri, no Oklahoma, and no Texas, of course. But then I would add West Virginia to the mix. And the reason is because I think West Virginia has been a fish out of water in the Big 12 conference. I think they're going to continue to be a fish out of water in the Big 12 conference. I'll touch on that in a little bit. But then, just for the sake of argument, you put West Virginia in the SEC. I think they would have a natural rivalry with both Kentucky as well as Tennessee, which, could help them recruiting wise and could help the Mountaineers somewhat once again be serviceable football wise. Because again, let's be realistic. What has West Virginia done since they went to the Big 12? Nothing. You look at the Big Ten conference. I would not have Maryland. I would not have Rutgers. I would not have Nebraska there. But I would substitute them with Pitt, Notre Dame, and Missouri. And for me, Pitt obviously in the Big East was solid. They're another team. I know that they did win the ACC football wise once, but I still think that Pitt is a fish out of water in the ACC. I look at it like this. It's that battle for Western Pennsylvania. And I think, with Penn State, and I think that being in that Big Ten would help Pitt, recruiting wise, because let's be realistic here. Pitt gets overshadowed as a football program, but Pitt has a long lineage of football greats, not just college football greats, pro football greats, pro football Hall of Famers. that have played for them. I mean, you can go down the list. Mike Ditka, Bill Fralick, Darrell Revis, Tony Dorsett, Dan Marino, Chris Dolman, Larry Fitzgerald, just to name a few. And I think, putting Pitt in the Big Ten would open things up for them more recruiting wise. I put Notre Dame in there because Notre Dame for the longest time has tried to have their cake and eat it too. They teased about joining the Big East. They were in the Big East for every other sport because with the exception of football because of that NBC deal. And from there, they flirted with the ACC. I know during the COVID year of 2020, they basically were an ACC team and they did make the ACC championship game. But nonetheless, Notre Dame gets the conference money, plays a certain amount of conference games where they're not a conference member, and they still get the NBC deal. I'll tell you like this: when Notre Dame first got that NBC deal more than 30 years ago, that was a big to do. Why? Because NBC was looking for football. That's number one, college football. Number two, back then, only the elite teams were on TV. You had one game on CBS, you might have had one or two games on ABC, and that was it. ESPN was not the mega power that it is. Fox did not have NFL action back then, more or less college football action. So it's one of those where, it was either CBS or ABC. Notre Dame was able to squeeze out that niche because, hey, we're Notre Dame. But I think those days are gone because everybody's on television now. So I think there's no longer that allure. And I think at some point, sooner rather than later, Notre Dame is going to have to join a conference. I also put Missouri in there. And I know people are going to say, well, why not put them in the Big Eight or Big 12? I still think that Missouri can have some rivalries in the Big Ten. I mean, you think about it, Missouri for the longest time, and they're looking like they're looking to get back to it. They played Illinois every year, and this was one of those where they used to meet in St. Louis at the Dome. I think that these two schools can go back to that. I think Missouri could have some rivalries to work with in the Big Ten. Now, looking at the Big 12, for me, it would have an old Southwest Conference feel. And I say that because you got the Texas schools, Texas, TCU, Texas Tech, Houston, SMU, Baylor, and A&M. And then you bring in some of those Big Eight schools as well, Oklahoma State, Nebraska, putting them back in that league, Colorado, Kansas, K-State, and Iowa State. And I think it could work. I know that when the Big 12 was trying to survive before, they didn't want to bring in Houston because they didn't want to bring in another Texas school. But anybody who's old enough to remember the days of the Southwest Conference remembers that in its heyday, with the exception of Arkansas, everybody in this league was in the state of Texas. Once you include Rice into that conversation as well, and I just think, for the sake of argument, I think it could be a great league. The Pac-12, I would just substitute Colorado and put Boise in there because to me, Colorado to me just never seemed like like they were a stick in the Pac-12. Utah has shown that they're clearly there. Utah needed to get to a Power 5 conference after being looked over, first in the WAC and then the Mountain West Conference. And then Boise. I mean, Boise, they're not what they were the last couple of years as far as a football power. And when I say football power, remember, Boise was consistently in the top 20, but I do think putting them in a conference like that would help. Obviously, clearly, the Pac 12 is not going to exist like we know it because, the bulk of the schools are leaving, and Oregon State and Washington State are left to try to mend this conference, if you will. But nonetheless, like I said, this is just for the sake of argument because clearly what I'm saying has no bearing whatsoever as far as the grand scheme of things with what is actually happening. The Mountain West, clearly you need to replace Boise. I put BYU in there. And then I put New Mexico State in that league as well, along with the other heavy hitters such as San Diego State, Colorado State, and San Jose State and Fresno State, just to name a few. The American Conference for me would have somewhat of a feel of the old Big East, but still some of the feel of the American. I put BC, Syracuse, Rutgers, Temple, Connecticut, Cincinnati, Memphis, Louisville, East Carolina, UCF, Navy, Massachusetts, Army, and South Florida in that league. Now, obviously, clearly that wouldn't happen because BC and Syracuse chased that money of the ACC. Rutgers chased the Big Ten money in, but I mean, it's one of those where I think it wouldn't just have a Northeast feel. I think for the most part, you could have an East Coast feel, and I think it could have been successful. The ACC, they wouldn't have as many members as they currently have. I would have them as an 11-team league. I put Maryland back in there. You obviously keep Miami and Virginia Tech as well, and I think Maryland. They've had flashes in the Big Ten conference, but Maryland is a tobacco road school. The bottom line, and you think about the rivalries basketball wise that Maryland had with North Carolina, Maryland had with Duke. Maryland belongs in the ACC. Conference USA, I'm going with Tulane, Rice, Tulsa, Middle Tennessee, Louisiana Tech, UAB, Western Kentucky, UTEP, Southern Miss, UTSA, Florida Atlantic, North Texas, Charlotte, Florida International, Sam Houston, and Marshall. The Sun Belt, basically for the most part, staying intact. App State, Georgia Southern, Georgia State, Troy, Louisiana, Arkansas State, Liberty, Jacksonville State, James Madison, Coastal Carolina, Old Dominion, Texas State, South Alabama, and Louisiana Monroe. While I would leave the MAC the way it is because for the most part, the MAC has been the only conference that really hasn't been affected. And I say only because, the Mountain West has lost schools to, bigger leagues. But again, like I've talked about this before, egos have damaged college athletics and it's a money grab and that's it. It's one of those where, like I've said before, rivalries are what makes sports. And it's one of those where it's not just about schools crossing regions to play, to join another conference. It's not just about an Oregon going to a Big Ten. It's not just about a Texas going to the SEC or Cal and Stanford going to the ACC. It's more than that. It's about the rivalries. And you think about it, and I'm not just talking about the rivalries that have been and are being destroyed because of schools breaking up conferences. No, I'm talking about the rivalries that are also being destroyed because there are so many teams within a conference. You think about the SEC, and there's a generation right now, they don't understand how big that Tennessee Alabama game is football wise. We're not going to see that much in the expanded SEC. We're not going to see Auburn take on Georgia that much in the SEC. And of course, typically these teams met, every weekend, like basically the same weekend every year. So these are rivalries, just some of them that are going to get lost in the wash. What about Tennessee, Florida? What about, Alabama, LSU? Looking at the Big Ten, even since the Big Ten expanded to 11 teams and then 14 teams, of course, you don't see Michigan play Minnesota that much. And I mean, that's a rivalry for those schools. Now we're not going to see Penn State play Ohio State as much and so many others. And let's not even talk about the rivalries that are being destroyed because of realignment. And one that comes to mind is Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. And of course, for so many years, once Texas A&M went to the SEC, that rivalry was left behind. And of course, there are kids that are growing up right now. They don't understand how big that rivalry was between A&M and Texas. And of course, that dates back to the old days of the Southwest Conference. Now, some of these leagues, in my opinion, lack rivalries, and it's only going to get worse. You look at the new Big 12 that's coming next year. Once you get Arizona, Arizona State, Utah, and Colorado into the mix. I think Colorado has a potential to have some rivalries in that league due to the fact that they played there in the Big 12 before. Clearly, it's not the same Big 12 that they left, but nonetheless. But I mean, are people really going to line up to see UCF take on Arizona? Are people really going to line up to see Utah play West Virginia? Are people really going to line up to see BYU play Baylor? I don't think so. And I mean, Cal, Stanford, and SMU going to the ACC. I think that's just a spit and glue model trying to patch things up. And then, of course, you've already got rumors about Florida State, looking at other conferences pre their snub for the college football playoff, and now they're talking about it even more. So this is never going to end because I said it before. Once Oregon, SC, UCLA, and Washington went to the Big Ten, it's only a matter of time before we get a 20-team college football conference. It's only a matter of time. It's going to happen within the next 5 years because what is going to continue to happen is that once the other conferences, and in this case, of course, the Big 12 and the ACC, once their members see the gap continue to grow money wise between them and the SEC and the Big Ten, guess what? There are going to be some heavyweights in those leagues that are going to say, hey, we want a bigger slice of the pie. And they're going to do whatever they have to do to get that piece from either the SEC or the Big Ten. Like I said before, I know people are calling for a legit commissioner at the NCAA level. It ain't going to happen. And again, it's the same thing with revenue sharing. You need it because it's not just the football that's affected. It's the other sports and it's the other kids that are now being forced to uproot and go into another conference. All of those kids that play softball and baseball out in California ain't going to want to go play in the Big Ten. Okay, that's the bottom line. And it's going to be like that for a lot of other sports with a lot of other schools that are being affected by this. I know that football rules the roost, but at some point, we got to just put a little more common sense into this thing and try to figure out a best case scenario. Again, like I said, revenue sharing should happen. It needs to happen, but it ain't because there's too many egos at the table saying, hey, well, I got to take care of my school, X, Y, and Z, but that's fine. But this is what happens when you don't have leadership at the top of your organization. Like I said, everything on here is hypothetical. It ain't going to stop the powers from that be from doing what they have done and doing what they will continue to do. But it's just one of those. What if we went back to the good days of focusing on regions and rivalries in college football? College football is a great brand, but it still has room to be better. So, folks, that's going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you haven't already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on the X, formerly known as Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. You can check it out, drop a line, and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So, once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin, and I am signing off. And I'm saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.